Nearly 10 years ago, the United Nations adopted a historic treaty, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And Akiko Ito was a proud architect of that treaty. Although the treaty was adopted in 2006, starting with 2001, with the establishment of the ad hoc committee, for the first time in the history of the United Nations, governments worked with civil society organizations and persons with disabilities, both women and men with disabilities. And to some extent, we saw that this transformed both the discourse of the United Nations, but the images that we frequently are used to seeing at the United Nations. For the first time, the United Nations halls of power were filled with women and men with disabilities drafting their own agenda, shaping their own futures and their destinies. And Akiko, I want you to take a moment to share with us insights from those heady days, those heady moments from 2001 to 2006, and your role in galvanizing governments and civil society and disability rights movements and groups to come and take over and own the United Nations for that brief shining moment.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here with you to share with you this important part of history of the United Nations. The United Nations, as you know, was established 70 years ago. This year is our 70th anniversary, and next year, as Rangita just said, the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations by the United Nations General Assembly of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this convention is such a unique convention, as already prefaced by Rangita, in that persons with disabilities, side by side, working with policymakers, representatives of governments, expert communities, they worked together, and they led most of the work that was done for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And my role was, in this context, of course, we were the part of the Secretariat, so we support the treaty making through bringing different intellectual resources together to present to the international community by inviting, for example, globally known expert like Ms. Rangita de Alwis, who is sitting next to me, and to help the decision makers understand what it means to codify international norms on the rights of persons with disabilities. Because in those days, there were two views. One view was that we have enough international human rights instruments, so we don't need to have a special instrument on disability or on the rights of persons with disabilities. And the second view, which prevailed, was that we do need a universal human rights instrument on the rights of persons with disabilities. And look at CEDAW. Look, this was the same argument. Of course, all human rights are women's rights, but it doesn't really change the fact that this universal codification process and the result, which is the convention, international convention itself, definitely give highest form of visibility in international normative discourse on the rights of persons with disabilities. So in this context, I think my role was to bring together, compile them, or to invite those global leaders to really to inform the international community as to why we need a human rights convention, specifically addressing the rights and the situations and perspectives of persons with disabilities. And I started the role prior to the process of the ad hoc committee which drafted this convention. We consulted with a number of human rights experts. We also consulted with governments to see what would be the best way for us to advance and strengthen the international normative framework on the rights of persons with disabilities. There were a number of answers. We needed to make maximum use of existing international human rights treaties, existing development commitments. But at the same time, there was a predominant view that, yes, international human rights instrument specifically focusing on advancement of the rights of persons with disabilities would definitely lead our way in the next century. So, so my role was to facilitate those different global leaders to come together to give specific again, contribution or bring different groups that never met before, like disability rights leaders, women's rights leaders, who shared with us their experience in promoting women's rights as an international human rights issue, and who succeeded in promoting gender equality and empowerment of women as one of the cross-cutting human rights and development issue in all aspects of the work of the United Nations. And I also was facilitating, again, the actual sessions, consultations with governments and organizations of persons with disabilities. So I think my role as a facilitator perhaps can be understood as the core part of the work that the United Nations Secretariat plays in order for us to advance international norms and standards on specific groups, on specific issues. So, but I think I had the privilege of being able to play that role together with women's rights, my colleagues, my dear colleagues, and also our esteemed global women's rights leaders, who truly made it possible for this convention to be gender inclusive and disability, of course, disability inclusive, gender inclusive, and also inclusive of all different dimensions of development.
I think what was so significant about the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was the way in which it brought women with disabilities, women on wheelchairs, women with significant physical as well as emotional, psychological disabilities to sit at the table and have their voices heard, have their experiences being validated and recognized and captured in the convention. And so both at a substantive level where their experiences counted, but also at a symbolic level where being at the table created a significant difference and a profound difference in the way in which UN treaties and norms were being created was I think one of the landmark results of the convention. So can you speak a little bit about the ways in which women with disabilities were brought to the table and how their voices were heard?
Yes. Thank you for a very important question, because I'm saying that it's so important because not because of gender, again, what gender perspective experience of women's rights bring to the CRPD. Not only that, but as Rangita just said, the fact that women leaders were seen as, first of all, there are three things. First of all, women with disabilities, to be seen as leaders in the international treaty process is rather limited. Unfortunately, if you still see the number of men and women who are leading treaty processes, you still have more men. It's significantly changing. But the fact that women with disabilities were leading, I think was very important. So from that perspective, a woman being at the table truly made a difference, because there and then women with disabilities can voice their concerns, their understanding, their again issues in their own voice. So that was one. And second, I think the leadership of women with disabilities, it also changed again the way that other issues were dealt with. For example, children with disabilities. Then, of course, now naturally, girls, gender perspective, more flows right into the issue of child's rights, and we also talk about independent living. Of course, then it flows right into this issue of to independent living. So I think much more than we realized at the time. I think that from that standpoint, it truly made a difference. And lastly, I think why the leadership of women with disabilities was so important was that they were able to give very specific, they were professional women who actually have a very high standing, and they were able to not only just give in gender perspective, but they themselves in their own as experts were able to give specific and very well supported contribution to the drafting process. So I think those combinations, the three dimensions, truly impacted on how the CRPD was viewed and how the CRPD is now being implemented.
And I think another impact of the CRPD was that for the first time, the world saw in a very visible way that these women with disabilities were not objects of charity, but that they were agents of power. And for the first time, the world witnessed this moment where women with disabilities were lawyers, who were parliamentarians, they were philosophers, they were law professors, and they were sitting at the table, because hitherto the stereotypical idea of especially women with disabilities, that they were objects of charity, that they needed to be cared for, and not as agents of change. So we really saw women with disabilities as agents of change and in positions of power. And I think that was really what created the most impact.
Yes. So in this context, U.S. leaders, U.S. women leaders with disabilities truly made a huge difference, because they, by the time that the convention process started, they had been to a number of UN activities, and they're one of the most experienced global leaders in the world, especially in the context of the work in development and disability and human rights. So yes, so that's something that we were all very much appreciative of.
So, as you said, that was an important moment in history, and I think the clarion call to action that you continue to amplify at the United Nations and around the world, both at the governmental level and at the civil society level, is the cry that was heard then and continues to be heard now: nothing for us without us. And that was really a significant change in the discourse at the United Nations. Now, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is known to be the first human rights treaty of the 21st century, and is really the first intersectional treaty. For the first time, a United Nations human rights treaty looked at the rights of children and women with disabilities. So looked at the different categories of discrimination and disability, including women and children. So can you speak to the ways in which that has really been transformational in both in law and in practice? So the recently passed constitution in Egypt in 2013 for the first time has included disability as a prohibited category of discrimination. And I think that's because of the kind of advocacy that has been carried out by the UN and by national actors. And around the world, what we see is that in equal protection lawmaking, disability has now been included as a prohibited category of discrimination, and especially women with disabilities, that women with disabilities are seeing as not just discriminated against because of their gender, but because of multiple grounds of discrimination, because of both their abilities, their gender, their race, and their ethnicity. So can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes. I would say that throughout the treaty process, there were many discussions as to whether there should be a gender perspective or child's perspective. from the very beginning, there was a willingness by member states to learn from CEDAW, learn from CRC. So that was a basis. And I think the involvement of the Committee on the Rights of the Child and Committee on the Elimination of All Discrimination and Forms of Against Women, CEDAW, also made a major impact on why the CRPD was able to secure this again cross-sectionality, a perspective on not just simply on disability, but also to be able to adapt two sets of lens when we try to promote and advance the rights of persons with disabilities. And I would just like to mention, go back very just quickly to where we stand now at the United Nations, because it provides the answer to your question. We are now in our 70th year, and we just adopted in the international community just adopted 2030 development agenda, which would be a global development framework for the coming 15 years. And in this context, again, this inequality and cross-sectionalities actually deriving from looking at different social groups and then understanding the complexity of inequality and discriminations now at the forefront. And in my work, we also try to see how best we can develop a new conceptual framework so that we can help the international community to operationalize this area of work. So I would say that Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities truly is in the midst of it. It also opened up again this understanding in policymakers' minds, or in our minds, and hopefully in future in everyone's mind, that disability is a cross-cutting issue, development issue, human rights issue. Disability is a part of everyone's life, and it has to be understood as such. But then we also need to think about the fact that people with disabilities are not just individuals with disabilities. They are women, they are children, they are indigenous people, part of indigenous communities. So in this context, I think CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is now opening up opportunities for the international community to organize how can we best address all of those inequality again that we need to address, and we need to tackle. We need to develop measures. We need to operationalize those measures through legislation, through again policies. So I would say that it has. So CRPD, the disability and the cross-sectionalities among different social groups and their experiences and their, again, history would hopefully help us galvanize our forces to tackle inequality in a very new and very strong and very much committed, again, very much deeply rooted in this commitment from many issues, decades of work and experiences.
So as you pointed out, the recently passed Sustainable Development Goals is really a landmark compact, global compact. And for the first time, because of the advocacy of persons with disabilities and other human rights groups, this a set of goals is people-driven, and disability is writ large across all 17 goals. It's not just a standalone goal, but it's really mainstreamed across the right to education, all of the development goals, and that's really a cause for celebration. I want to remind you of a case that I worked on in Nepal with disability rights and women's groups, which really, I think, is quintessentially symbolic of what you spoke about, how it's important to bring both groups together. Under the Muluk Ain in Nepal, the civil law in Nepal, husbands could divorce a wife who became disabled during the time of marriage. But this was not available for a wife. A wife could not divorce a husband who became disabled during the period of the marriage. So this was really not just disability discrimination, but gender discrimination, because it brought together both the ways in which women with disabilities are discriminated. And in arguing the case, the women's rights lawyer invoked both the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as significant landmark conventions that applied to Nepal. So my final question to you, Akiko, is that given the significance of this convention, and given that nearly 100% of the countries have ratified this, with only 27 countries that are yet not to ratify it, and just a couple of days ago the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, ratified it, the US stands alone in not ratifying this important convention. Can you speak to that and why it is important for the United States to ratify this profoundly important convention on human rights?
Yes, United States is a signatory to this convention, and I had a privilege of being at the ceremony of signature. When U.S. We signed this convention, and I had such a great privilege to work with the U.S. community, human rights community within the United States, to really build a foundation for this convention. I can just name so many individuals who were directly instrumental in bringing this convention to life. Not only the drafting of the text, or not only of actually promoting it during the ad hoc committee, but also trying to promote it internationally already in different parts of the world, using the convention language and promoting, again, the US experience as well. So I think in reality, it is happening that many US advocates are using the convention and to advance, again, the rights of persons with disabilities. I understand that there are so many disability rights leaders who are working together at national level for the ratification by the United States, and we hope that we will be able to also to work closely with the United States to further advance this instrument, this global instrument, to transform realities of persons with disabilities on the ground into realities that gives us specific tools to create inclusive society and inclusive development. Because there's so many things that the United States can do, and they're already US is already doing so many, they're contributing as we speak now at the third committee of the General Assembly, and the US representative is very active in working on human rights issues, including disability rights issue, and we hope to continue to work together with US representatives and also US civil society to advance the global commitment in disability rights in the future. Yes.